Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jan Beagle, the Director General of IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this discussion. It is a pleasure to see a truly global audience coming together with a global panel in support of justice for women and girls. I would like to thank our partners, UN Women, the World Bank Group, the Pathfinders, the Elders, and many others with whom we have endeavored to put gender equality at the center of global justice conversations over the past few years. It is a privilege working with you on this issue. As we all know, justice for women and girls is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment in SDG 5, and its promise of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies in SDG 16. IDLO views SDG 16 and SDG 5 as a prism through which the rule of law can help drive and accelerate progress across the entire 2030 agenda. Ensuring justice for women is more than just supporting women going to courts. It is more than ensuring judicial systems are fair and effective. It is about enabling fair justice outcomes for women and creating inclusive and just societies that value women and girls as equal members. We know that when women and girls thrive, communities and states thrive. But to thrive, women and girls need to be able, not just on paper, but in practice, in all areas of life that affect them. Laws and justice institutions play an essential role in realizing women's rights. However, for many women, laws and institutions are themselves tools of oppression and sources of inequality, injustice, and insecurity. We know, including from our joint report on justice for women released last year, that too often women's justice needs continue to remain unaddressed, from gender-based violence, discrimination at work, discriminatory family laws, unequal access to land and property, gaps in access to legal identity, and persistent exclusion from decision-making. More than 1 billion women still do not have legal protection from intimate partner violence. Over 2.7 billion women are legally restricted from having the same choice of jobs as men. Over 45% of women lack an ID compared to 30% of men. And less than 25% of constitutional court justices globally are women. And we are living in an extraordinary time. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a devastating global impact, has had a disproportionate effect on women and girls. The latest report on justice for women amidst COVID-19, jointly published this year with the co-organizers of this webinar, shows clearly that the pandemic has worsened the situation of women and girls, especially those who are already in situations of vulnerability, those living in poverty or with disability, migrants, those who are undocumented, and those who are detained or imprisoned. It has increased the justice gap. Our Justice for Women Amidst COVID-19 report outlines 10 practical policy recommendations to safeguard women's access to justice during this crisis. 1. Recalibrate justice delivery to ensure that justice institutions are fully responsive to the rights and needs of all population groups during this period of crisis. 2. Protect rights holders and duty bearers. 3. Substitute full trials with interim orders. 4. Protect women deprived of their liberty. 5. Repeal discriminatory laws. 6. Include women as decision makers. 7. Partner with informal and customary and informal justice systems to ensure the alignment of such systems with gender equality norms and standards. 8. Address the digital divide, especially the digital gender gap. 9. Strengthen legal empowerment policies and the role of women's organizations. And 10. Invest in data and monitoring and in evidence-based policies that address the social and economic, as well as the legal impacts of the pandemic on women and girls. We believe that current challenges can be turned into opportunities. We can and must make the disruption of the pandemic a catalyst for long-term change, learning from good practices around the world and investing resources and political support to empower women and build back better for everyone. We need to listen to the experience of women and girls, especially those on the margins, and use their ideas. We need more women in positions of leadership at global, national, and local levels. For IDLO, the only global intergovernmental organization exclusively devoted to advancing the rule of law to promote peace and sustainable development, addressing justice for women and girls is a central and indispensable component of our work. Gender equality is at the core of our mandate. Reducing the justice gap for women and girls is one of the 3 pillars of IDLO's new strategic plan, which is focused on people-centered justice. I would like to thank all of you who participated in our global consultations to develop the plan and hope to see you at the launch on 24th of November. IDLO works in all regions across the justice chain to ensure that women's justice needs are addressed, to make justice sector institutions more responsive to women, to repeal and reform discriminatory laws, and promote the adoption of gender-responsive ones, and to support the empowerment of women and girls. This month, the international community is commemorating the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which calls for women's equal participation in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in the maintenance of international peace and security. But as I noted recently at the United Nations observance of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Conference, having participated in Beijing myself, while there has been significant progress towards gender equality, much remains to be done to ensure the participation of women at all levels of leadership. Justice and the rule of law are critical to fulfilling the responsibilities we committed ourselves to in Beijing and the Security Council committed itself to in Resolution 1325. So, in the words of the title of this webinar, let's move from commitment to action. I'm happy to hand over to the moderator, Ilaria Botilero, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Director General, for your inspiring remarks and most of all for your commitment to gender justice. Welcome everyone again. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Ilaria Botilero, the Director of Policy, Research and Learning at IDLO. I'll be your moderator today. Before we get into the substance of our discussion, please allow me to share with you a few brief housekeeping information. Our session will be recorded and we are also on Facebook Live. Our chat is open. We will be sharing some interesting facts, materials, information through the chat, including the speakers' bios, the Justice for Women and COVID-19 report, the newly released handout for the report. So please feel free to look at the chat, interact with other participants through the chat. It's always wonderful to see an active network of friends and colleagues. We will start our session with some special remarks who will help us set the scene and I'm sure will inspire our conversations and reflections moving forward. We will then move to our panel discussion where a great group of experts and practitioners will help us understand some of the possible pathways to improve justice for women and girls. If you have a question for our panelists later on, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And our IDLO gender team will gather your questions and I will feed them to the panelists during the dedicated interactive dialogue session, which will take place at around 15:10 Rome time. As for me, please allow me a few words before we start our dialogue, just to say that we are truly at a difficult juncture in the fight for gender equality and justice for women. Prior to the pandemic, 2020 was expected to be a year to accelerate progress in the implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, 25 years since its adoption. 2020 was also supposed to be the year projected to jumpstart the decade of accelerated action to deliver on the global goals, including SDG 16 and SDG 5. Last year, when we launched the Justice for Women report together with our partners, there was real enthusiasm and hope for fast action and change in some of the most challenging areas of concern for women worldwide: GBV, discriminatory laws and practices, equal access to justice. Now, 1 year forward, there is major and well-founded concern that COVID-19 will push back and has pushed back the fragile progress on gender equality and women's access to justice. We have concrete evidence that COVID-19 has exacerbated pre-existing problems and entrenched violations of basic rights of women and girls, as reflected in our recently published report, which you will find, for which you will find the link in the chat. It is therefore essential to continue our action and advocacy to figure out together how to address justice gaps and accelerate joint action and investment in justice for women and girls. Now, today we are very, very lucky to have with us some powerful voices that I'm sure will inspire us to continue the fight and will provide us with practical pathways to ensure that women enjoy fair justice outcomes and redress, and that women are put at the center of the justice chain and not at the margins or outside, where they most often find themselves, whether they like it or not. It is therefore my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest today, who will share with us some special remarks. Please take a moment to look at their bios in the chat. They're all committed champions of women's rights, and we are very fortunate to have them with us today. So let me please introduce with you the special remarks speakers, Ms. Shalene Curtis-Micallef, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Ministry of Justice of Canada. We also have with us the Honorable Justice Professor Lilian Tibatemwa Eriki Kubinza, Supreme Court of Uganda. It's also a pleasure to welcome Ms. Hina Jilani from the Elders, a great defender of human rights and especially gender champion. And we also have with us, with much pleasure, Ms. Liv Torres, who is the Director of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Justice and Inclusive Societies. So a very warm welcome to our special remarks speakers. And with that, I hand the floor to Shalene from the Ministry of Justice of Canada. Thank you very much, Shalene. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, dear colleagues. On behalf of the Deputy Minister, Nathalie Drouin, it is my pleasure to join this timely discussion. I would like to thank the partner organizations of this event and acknowledge their tremendous work in advancing access to justice for women. This topic is very close to the Deputy Minister's heart and to mine as well. So it's quite an honor for me to join such distinguished panelists today. As part of the overall vision of the Global Week for Justice, today's discussions build on the foundational work that has driven the UN 2030 agenda, namely to leave no one behind. Together, Sustainable Development Goal 5, Gender Equality, and 16, Justice for All, shine a spotlight on all women and girls becoming full and equal participants in our societies. In realizing this vision, we have a common purpose. More than ever before, we must keep this spotlight laser focused on women's access to justice as a means to attain equality and as a way to empower women and girls to realize their full potential. Over the past 7 months, this need has been even more urgent and even more evident. In Canada, as in many places around the world, women have borne an unequal share of the economic and social disruption that compounded the health crisis of COVID-19. Throughout the pandemic, women have endured a disproportionate impact as healthcare workers, as frontline workers, and as unpaid caregivers at home. Some have experienced precarious employment, exposing and deepening existing economic vulnerabilities. This in turn has opened the door to greater housing, consumer, and debt-related problems. In many areas, a lack of available technology has left many unable to access justice services. As another factor compounding these challenges, it has been extremely difficult to provide in-person services and assistance. In some cases, the lack of in-person care may be a mere inconvenience. But for women and children facing exploitation or domestic violence, it can be devastating. Our government is committed to addressing these issues, and work is already underway. We are working to help minimize negative impacts when victims and survivors engage with the justice system. We're also working with our colleagues at Women and Gender Equality Canada and to develop a national action plan to address gender-based violence. This is why our discussions today are essential and urgent. We know that our country cannot succeed if half of our population is being held back. As the pandemic continues to have an impact on our work, on our lives, on the justice sector is finding many lessons to take away from this difficult time. And one of these lessons is the critical importance of data collection. We have seen how rich data sources inform decision-making in the health sector. In order to better inform policy and improve the delivery of justice services, we need to explore more deeply individual perspectives and adopt a people-focused approach. This is particularly true for vulnerable or marginalized groups such as Indigenous women, Black women, immigrant women, women with disabilities. The justice sector must find and eliminate the gaps in our understanding of how people experience justice problems, and this requires disaggregated data. We are committed to evolving the justice system to be more responsive to those it serves and to protecting the rights of our most vulnerable. In closing, I want to thank you for your openness to share your experiences and to learn from different voices. Events like today's forum are vitally and critically important, and they keep that spotlight right where it belongs. Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shaleen. And our thanks and gratitude also go to the Deputy Minister Drouin for her continued involvement in the Justice for Women project. We're very grateful for your support and in championing this important issue. And now let me give the floor to the Honorable Justice Professor Lilian Tibatemwa Eririkubinza. Just Lilian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And I'm privileged to share my ideas with people who have a passion for justice for women and girls. I will limit my comments to a very specific issue relating to the way that women's rights to justice and indeed access to justice has been negatively impacted during COVID-19 in Uganda. Information has come in that perhaps, as is the case with many countries, there's been an escalation of violence against women, and more specifically, sexual abuse of women and girls during the restrictions which were introduced by government to ensure or to help deal with the issue of the spread of the virus. Now, whereas it has come out very clearly that there has been an escalation and there continues to be an escalation of sexual assaults against women, and which has, for example, been clearly evidenced in the escalation of teenage pregnancies. On the other hand, there's been a decrease in the reporting of cases to institutions such as the police. I presume that the decrease in reporting certainly is not an indication that there is less violence against women, but on the other hand is in fact a result of the fact that there is restriction in physical movement of the victims. Most of the victims have been using traditional methods of reporting, and therefore when somebody is assaulted either sexually or physically, they move physically to the police. Now, with the restrictions, which included public transport being prohibited from moving, and in fact, later, even private vehicles were prohibited or were banned from moving, what has happened is that as the violence escalates, the reporting to institutions such as the police, the reporting to actors such as the Association of Women Lawyers in Uganda, who have had a lot of work to do in protecting women, has gone up. So the question is, how has government responded to the decrease in reporting, well aware that the decrease is not a sign of decrease of the prevalence of sexual assaults? The Ministry of Gender, as well as the actors such as Association of Women Lawyers, have resorted to non-traditional reporting mechanisms. For example, government, and more specifically the police, has established toll-free numbers so that victims of violence can actually ring and report assaults which they are suffering from. We also see, apart from toll-free numbers, we see the introduction and upscaling of digital platforms, which enable people to use smartphones to report the violence that they're experiencing. Now, we will say that certainly the use of non-traditional methods to report violence is a welcome innovation, because it is in recognition of the fact that physical improvement, rather physical movement, is a problem. However, the question we should always ask is, what are the limitations of the alternative reporting mechanisms? An attempt to embrace technology as a tool for enhancing access to justice is certainly to be applauded. Nevertheless, I think any innovation that is introduced must be grounded in the lived realities of the societies we are dealing with. And we know that adoption of technology is based on certain presumptions. And one of the presumptions is that the victims will have access to phones. And yet information coming out is, there's information coming out that there is limited access to phones for women and children. And yet it's women and children who are suffering from sexual assault. It is a fact, and I think it has already been referred to, that there is a gender digital divide or gap, and the inability to access e-response platforms disproportionately affects women. So it is important that we think further in how we can make sure that, whereas indeed there is an advantage that the urban woman, the corporate woman, would rather use these platforms and remain anonymous for as long as she can. We are dealing with the urban poor woman who cannot access a phone or who doesn't have a smartphone. And I think that is very important. What else can we do beyond the use of digital, non-traditional methods. And I think that's where we have to, again, make use of informal systems such as the local councils in the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Judge Lillian. And thank you also for having highlighted the problem that the gender digital divide poses in terms of reporting and access to justice, and ultimately ensuring fair justice outcomes for women. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to hand the floor to Ms. Hina Gilani from the Elders. Ms. Gilani is an exceptional defender of human rights and women's rights. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us today, Hina. The floor is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to the organizers for putting together this virtual forum on a subject which is very close to my heart, of course, but which is also a subject that we have been discussing a lot, especially in view of what is being done in the wake of this pandemic that we are all confronting all over the world. As you all know, that it has also been my privilege, together with many of you present in this forum, to contribute to this important discussion as a co-chair of the Task Force on Justice. As one of the elders, I'm also very proud of the fact that the elders did launch an Access to Justice program in February last year. And we have always emphasized that women's justice needs must always be kept at as a priority on any discussion on access to justice. I would like to just say very briefly my own views on the whole subject of women's access to justice and justice for women. You know, I have always felt that for me, justice for women really means it's not just to ensure relief and redress against discrimination or violence, but also to ensure that justice is delivered in a manner that empowers women. It is therefore very important for me, not just having laws and recognizing women's entitlement to the human rights and fundamental freedoms that are so necessary for them to promote their well-being, both through the justice system and also attain justice within the social environment in which they live. So I do believe that processes, procedures, mechanisms on the grounds that we set up for implementation of the rights is extremely important. You know, as in my 40 years as an activist, I have seen many victories, both as a part of the global women's movement and of the women's movement in my own country. Unfortunately, much of what we won did not really bring the real benefit to us because something was missing. And that something really was the commitment to ensure that we have in place processes, that we have created enough space in our legal and social systems as well as protection systems, the space to make sure that women can easily, with dignity, access justice for themselves. I think that this pandemic that we are now confronting has in many ways pointed out the weaknesses in our responses, despite all the legal battles we may have won or legislative victories that we may have won over the years. I think we can very clearly now see how globally there are rising rates of violence against women. and more challenges for women to access justice services. Women are losing livelihoods at a faster rate than men. Women and girls from marginalized communities are especially at risk. And to give you an example, in the United Kingdom, Black women are over 4 times more likely than white women to die from COVID-19. These are startling figures that we are getting. The global Black Lives Matter movement protests have also highlighted the racial discrimination many women face in justice systems across the world. Of course, this is notwithstanding the fact that crises are never gender neutral. So obviously, men are there, but women are under a double jeopardy, as we've been saying for many years as well. You know, the 2020 year now marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration. We also know that while there has been much to celebrate over the years, in the past, you know, at least the quarter of the century when the Beijing Declaration was made, we have also had several impediments over the years to progress in achieving the goals of the Beijing Declaration and the Vienna Platform for Action. I am sure that, you know, we are going to keep having these discussions and marking out the milestones for ourselves again and again. Yet, I think it's very important that we do create the structures where it is possible for women to take forward the agenda for implementation of every commitment that governments at the national level or the multilateral systems have made in order to make sure that women are able to bridge the inequality rift that we have today. I just want to make 3 important points and much focused on the current pandemic and the emergency that we are facing. And just before I start on that, I also want to make clear that I am not just focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that this must be a lesson for us to respond to and learn from in order to deal with other civil crises as well as other conflict-related crises in which women will always lose out on the collective gains that we have made. Firstly, I think amongst those who have really made their contributions on access to justice, including justice for women, the civil society efforts are least appreciated. And I think this is something that governments in particular need to hear. We need to do more to support collective action of women's groups. I think it's very impressive when we see that around the world, women have responded by mobilizing against the challenges that are posed by this pandemic. Women's groups, they really need to be included and they need to be funded in order to be able to respond and help governments fulfill their responsibilities. I think donors need to hear all this. And as an elder, I'm proud to say that the elders supported the launch of the COVID-19 Grassroots Justice Fund in July in order to get more resources to frontline justice workers. Secondly, I would also like to say that we must not overlook women deprived of their liberty. And this is just an example of the marginalized communities that we are most likely to overlook when we are in a panic to respond to something which we have never seen before. Now, in my own country, although I must say that we have never been very appreciative of Pakistan's response at the state level to human rights crisis, I must say that we are really happy that one of the steps taken by the current government, despite its failures in other areas, was to release a lot of women from prison. And this, in many ways, lightened the burden on prison authorities to deal with the pandemic in the face of overpopulation of prisons, endangering people's health. So I think this was an important thing that I needed to mention. Thirdly, I think we really need to incorporate more women in decision making. This should not just become a rhetoric. We must really have women who are taking decisions, and women who are really aware of the least of the most marginalized people and their problems, who should be able to imaginatively cater for their needs in the emergency response of governments. We know that women are few in the justice system, and that their increase is something that we expect would in many ways also increase with not just women's access to justice, but also to respond to their justice needs. We need not only to build back better, but also to build back equally. We have been presented the opportunity to reimagine and redesign our society into a vibrant and equitable one. We must place women and justice for women at the core of the response and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hina. Your points are very well taken, especially we will definitely reflect on the point you made about justice delivery, the importance of focusing on the entirety of the justice chain. So processes, procedures, not only the idea of justice and access to justice. So thank you for that. Let me now hand the floor. It's a great pleasure to have with us the director of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Inclusive, and Peaceful Justice and Inclusive Societies, who are also among the organizers of this Justice Week. So Ms. Liv Torres, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And let me start by saying that I'm really happy and honored to be in this fantastic company and webinar addressing maybe the most important issue we have on our table these days. There's already been a lot of good comments made, so I'm going to try and avoid repeating previous good comments, but let me just underline a few things. We have a massive challenging situation. We are trying now to basically map what are the lessons and good practices that can help us go forward. And I'd like to underline just a few of them. I think the first thing we need to do is to address that there are disparities and discrimination. And that sounds like the obvious thing to most of us in this webinar, but the recognition needs to be made in order to address it. And I think that's worth reiterating. We had major challenges before COVID. We were making slight progress in some of the areas when it comes to girls' education. The wage gap was lowering in parts of the world, etc. But we also had major challenges. We had major opposition to addressing the issues, and then of course came COVID. So recognizing the disparities and the discrimination, I think is point number one. Point number two is to recognize the value of actually doing something about it. Underlining the gains we can make, the commitments we have made, the economic value of addressing this, etc. Realizing and underlining the value of addressing the problem is crucial. Then I think My next point is to also recognize that we have huge resistance out there. There are people, structures, systems that actually do not want to address the justice gap. And that needs to be recognized in order for us to fight better and fight harder, because we want to achieve real results and we want to address the justice gap in order to make it disappear. Now, that also means, and that's my next point, that data gathering, mapping the situation, having statistics knowledge in place in order to address the challenges is crucial. I think the task force Justice for All report that we did was very important from the Pathfinders side. I think the joint report that we've done with the conveners of this webinar, called the Justice for Women in the Pandemic, was crucial also as a stepping stone in the mapping that I'm laying out as needed. But more information needs to be put on the table. We need to identify the early interventions. We need to use the justice system in order to assure that women's issues and cases are not shelved, that there are not disparities in terms of sentencing, etc. We need to abolish the discriminatory laws. We need to learn from those countries that have actually now come up with new creative, innovative solutions in addressing domestic violence. The apps that we heard about, the toll-free numbers, the Spanish and French experiences with resources in supermarkets and pharmacies in order for women to report domestic violence, ask for help. There's lots of innovative solutions out there that I think need to be shared. Australia's family courts, they are fast tracking all lockdown related cases to mitigate risks of violence. Another reference point for other countries. So there's lots of good lessons and practices out there that we need to share and that we can learn from. How can we urge more action and commitment? I think there's a clear justice or legal argument to be made, and we have to underline all these good arguments when we go forward. There's a justice and legal argument, which is basically that we have signed on to universal rights and conventions again and again, and we need to respect them. Point number two, there's a solidarity argument. The people that are most vulnerable and in need are often women and girls, so we need to stretch out our hands. There's a labor market argument to be made in order for addressing the justice gap, which is that women are often at the front line, and they're also often the people paid the least and most vulnerable in the labor market. There's a governance argument to be made for addressing the justice gap, which is that good governance is about representing everyone equally and having everyone at the table. That also means that we need more women, of course, around the table. There is a massive economic argument to be made. We know that our economies are badly hit by COVID, but we also know that countries can gain enormous by including women at an equal footing as men. There's been calculations done showing how the gross national products can grow by up to 25% if we remove the barriers to women. Then keep in mind also that UNESCO has argued that 11 million girls stand the chance now of losing out of school because of the pandemic. Now that's 11 million talents lost. We have to assure that we actually address the challenges in order to build back better. And let me underline one last issue. There's an organizational argument to be made for addressing the justice gap. We need to build civil society and the organizational muscles to move the feminist movement forward. Civil society is of crucial importance in addressing these challenges, and building stronger organizations, I think, is alpha and omega. Now, how do we strengthen the alliances and the international work? I think this webinar is a very good example of how to build strong cross-national movements of solidarity in order to fight harder and build back better. I believe in underlining, underlining all the time the linkages between justice, education, health, welfare, violence. These hang together, the various SDGs. Justice is crucial in order to address education, health challenges. Unless we address justice, we will have probably a problem with increasing unrest and violence. So we need to address the SDGs together. Let me say one last thing. I do think it is important to underline and put spotlight on the challenges we have and the discrimination and the disparities. But I also do believe that it's crucial to showcase that there are numerous fearless women out there, champions of justice for women, and they are role models for so many millions of young girls and women all around the world. And they can actually also, by building stronger alliances, as we are doing now, showcase the need to fight harder and build back better by stronger bonds between us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Liv. How inspiring and also true. Thank you for having reminded us that justice for women, in fact, is not it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. It makes sense from so many points of view. So it's not just a question of basic human rights. It also makes sense, as you so eloquently have shared with us. So thank you. And with that, we are concluding the special remarks. It has been really inspiring. And I would like to thank all our special remarks panelists. But let me now introduce you to a great group of friends and colleagues who will help us dig a little bit deeper into some of the key questions that underline these basic issues of justice for women and girls. So I am joined today by, again, a great group of panelists. So let me introduce you to Dr. Amrita Kapoor, who is the project coordinator for the Gender and Security Division of the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. We also have with us Ms. Denise Dora, the founder and board member of TEMIS. We have Ms. Rachel Boma, who is the program specialist in women's access to justice and Parliament with UN Women Tanzania office. We also have an IDLO colleague, Ms. Teresa Mugaza, the Kenya country manager for the International Development Law Organization. And finally, we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Tatiana Teplova, the head of division and senior counselor for the Gender Justice and Inclusiveness of the OECD. So thank you so much, dear friends and colleagues, for having joined us today for this discussion. I would like to reflect and explore with you a little bit more in depth some of the issues that our colleagues have already highlighted during the first part of the meeting. Starting with you, Amrita, you have extensive experience working on gender issues in a variety of countries, and in very difficult situations involving major violations of women's rights, amounting several times to crimes against humanity or even war crimes. In your experience, what is the importance of solid justice sector responses to violence against women, including domestic violence, especially in the current situation in the context of the pandemic? Are there any lessons that we can learn at this stage? Over to you, Amrita.
Thank you so much, Ilaria, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel, particularly because it does touch upon an issue that's incredibly close to my heart. It's the sort of core of the work that I do in terms of supporting gender-sensitive judicial and security reform, as you mentioned, in a lot of challenging contexts. So I'm going to touch on a few examples with a disclaimer that obviously the report that you published early this year is itself a wonderful resource for various strategies and approaches in terms of justice understood more broadly. I'm going to focus a little bit more narrowly, both in terms of giving some interesting concrete examples and also in the interest of time. And I will preface my comments by saying that fundamentally, we also need to recognise that so much of what we're witnessing and the challenges we're facing are a result of a securitised response to a health pandemic. It's not a fit-for-purpose response to the problem that we're facing. And this has, as we've seen, profound short-term problems, but also will have longer-term impacts on women and girls' access to justice. So I see here this sort of knife edge in some ways where we can see that there are so many unintended consequences of how we're responding to this unfolding and incredibly long-term emergency crisis. And secondly, at the same time, how do we envisage a different type of justice? And I think there are lessons to be learned, not just in this period with coronavirus, but also from what we've already learnt around, gender-sensitive institutional reform and governance, as Liv Torres mentioned. And I want to also mention, as a sort of introductory remark, that I absolutely subscribe to, Hina Jelani's point around recognising the intersectional nature of this lack of access to justice, and the fact that it's very important to build that into the lens of how we see institutions responding in a more sensitive and effective way, because frankly right now we see that there are lots of ways in which they're not so effective. So I'm going to look at domestic violence as a paradigm within which we can extract two key lessons, and the first of these is how can we use these lessons learned in an ad hoc crisis context to be actually establish them as structured and embedded partnerships and processes. And a key aspect of that, I think, in terms of domestic violence is what we've seen is the innovative nature of some of the ways in which communities and NGOs have tried to navigate this. And as you mentioned, the digital gap, the fact that, it's one thing to talk about, and I was going to mention Spain and France and the fact that women can access these services in pharmacies and chemists in more innovative ways, the pop-up counters that appeared in New York in relation to domestic violence. But I think the harder place is places like Honduras, right, with small houses, overcrowding, lots of scrutiny if you're in lockdown where you're only let out once a fortnight. these are the hardest places to really access. And sort of one of the interesting examples that came out there was actually calling for pizza or for other types of food that still happens in Honduras and happens without a smartphone. But in fact, there was a special number that had been circulated, and that was a way that women accessed services and help when they were under scrutiny within a home context. We know, for example, NGOs in Egypt collected data through launching a gender tracker to monitor the impact of the restrictions on women and other vulnerable groups to then feed into public advocacy. And that's similarly Algeria, Morocco, Lebanon, there were NGOs that really set up alert networks for referral services. I think one interesting example comes from Kyrgyzstan, where they embarked on a new model of cooperations with civilians in the local community, where they had mobile teams and interagency response, crisis centre representatives and the police. So very much a partnership model that then led to a much more adaptive response and provided a holistic support service to victims. And I think this is a neat segue into the fact that we need to think about this as something to embed permanently. So in fact, they did convert that from a temporary measure to a permanent measure to respond to domestic violence. And I think this highlights the need to think about changing the justice processes. We see that evidence collection, investigating protocols are affected by COVID. They're affected by all of these restrictions, and we need to be forward thinking about A, how do we do this in a way that doesn't damage access to justice in the long term, and B, how can we see this tension sometimes between defendant rights and victims' rights in a new way. And so one example is in Northern Ireland, where the recommendation was that pre-recorded cross-examination could be seen as one way to sort of minimise re-traumatisation of survivors. And this has come up in the COVID emergency context, but the idea that we can still protect a defendant's rights while you do pre-recorded cross-examination before trial. And so I guess, conceptualising what justice might look like in the longer term. And the second aspect I would just mention is the valuable role that internal and external oversight play. I think Hina already alluded to this, that justice systems are responding to unprecedented conditions, regularly changing regulations that affect individuals' rights and law and order more broadly. And they're often responding with incomplete data and with limited or mismatched resources. And so I think when we look at, for example, emergency legislation that increases powers of security and justice actors, we also need to make sure that we're protecting, citizens' rights, and particularly the vulnerable, like women and girls, in terms of justice through the independent oversight mechanisms, whether that's internal but also external, whether it's government, but also critically in the form of partnerships with civil society organisations, including in the design of responses, like I mentioned in Kyrgyzstan. And so I think I would just end on this question of governance, which is, as Liv Torres mentioned, it is a critical pillar for how we see justice. And I think we have lessons that we've gained from looking at gender-sensitive justice and security reform. How do you transform institutional cultures? Because it's only by doing that you can change the structures, the processes, and the way that people behave so that they can integrate gender into the core of their approach, whether it's in a crisis or a non-crisis context. And to me, that's how you build back better. So I'll finish my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I see that there are a lot of questions coming in. So thanks also to all of you who are posing questions. And this is a great incentive for us to move through our program and leave some space for questions. So they're all very interesting, and the panelists, I'm sure, will be very happy to respond during the question time. But I do have a question actually for Denise. So Denise, you are a lawyer and a human rights activist working every day to ensure that legal empowerment and leadership of women in their communities are preserved, so that women are better equipped with the tools to realize their rights. So I wanted to ask you, in your view, what is the value of empowerment approaches, especially in the context of the pandemic? Are there some good practices, some lessons from your region, Latin America, that you can share with us today? Thank you, Denise. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ilaria. Many thanks to all of you. Good morning from Brazil. I'm specifically living in South America, in Brazil, where 155 people have already died, unfortunately, most of them indigenous populations, marginalized groups, and we have more than 5 million people who were tested positive. So the situation is really hard. And under this context, what we've seen is the voices of women coming to talk about their situation of being isolated with their abusers. Either in domestic violence situations or sexual violence situation against women, young women and girls. It's really hard to think about a house without a rule of law, where everything can be done against women, and in a situation where you cannot go to services because they are closed, you cannot move around the city because transport are forbidden, and you cannot ask for help in traditional ways of asking for help for women. So curiously, when we see the data, there is a decrease, a reduction in the number of registers about violence against women, as we've seen in other countries as well, and it was already mentioned here. Although there is an increase in the numbers of femicide of 24% in the first period of this year in Brazil. It's every day there are 13 women who are killed in Brazil only because they are women. So working for 30 years with access to justice for women and legal empowerment programs in Amidst, gender justice and human rights organization, we were wondering what to do and what lessons we can learn from this experience, but also what we could do in a different and better way in such an emergency situation. The first thing that we've learned is that traditional legal services approach is archaic. It's not only traditional, but it's something that was constructed, developed in the last 300 years for a group of population that was much more reduced and did not include women. So when we think about this traditional approach of justice, which a group of experts delivers service for millions of people who cannot have access to education or even to go to the courts because they don't have money to pay for transportation, we can think that there is something wrong. And when we see that in a pandemic like this, what the first thing that these services do is to close their doors and not help victims who are seeking for justice and who need really their help, then we see that it's really, really wrong. So what we are proposing here is to rethink the paradigm of justice as a delivery system for services coming from a kind of top-down approach. And rethinking this on basis of community, legal empowerment, legal education for groups of people, listening the voices of women, listening their experiences, making sure that the idea of justice is more than a governmental service where you have a kind of a passive voice and are most of the time discriminated, as we also talked here, and have to beg for some help. This is wrong. This is not working. And it has not worked under this COVID situation. So some of the experience that we've seen in some countries are very creative, like thinking about temporary shelters in hotels and other places, special alert services in supermarkets, pharmacies, and places where women usually go, investment in online services, investment in civil society groups and community networks, and also about new legislation. This is what happened in Brazil as well. While the justice sector just closed their doors, civil society groups start pushing the parliament to approve a legislation, which was approved in July this year, saying to the justice sector, well, at least you have to have online services. You have to provide electronic protective orders for women who are in really danger of losing their lives. With these changes in way of thinking about the justice sector and services have to operate, there are some experiences that I would like to highlight. One, the use of apps, applications. Recognizing that there is a digital divide, this is some that we have to tackle as part of our access to justice agenda. And one of the things that we did in Themis was to distribute Sling cards for a group of women paralegal in some cities to help other women to communicate at least. We also created some WhatsApp groups, something very simple that we do with our friends and families, of 20 women who could talk with each other in these situations of violence and seek for some help, information, way of surviving this crisis. The other thing that was possible to do, and we did in Brazil, is to have some specific apps for thematic. For example, domestic workers. We have an app called Laudelina, which connects thousands of women who lost their jobs because of the crisis and are domestic workers and are able to talk with each other through specific techniques. The third thing that I would like to do is, after negotiations with the local legal services, we were able to get information from the Justice Court about protective orders. So what they are doing in some cities is to send to Themis the information that we have released these protective orders to these women, and then we share this with paralegal in communities who can visit her. So they can walk to, they are living in the same neighborhood, they have the same language, they understand each other, and they can go and see how she is. So I'm talking about some examples just to say this idea of here is the justice and here is the people, and people have to go to the justice and beg for some service. It's not working anymore. We have more than 2 billion people without access to the services. We need to be creative and do new things and shift the paradigm. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you, Denise. And thanks for sharing with us these lessons. And I see the questions are coming in, so we will have more time to talk about some of these innovations and solutions at the local level. Just to continue our conversation, I also have a question for Rachel. Rachel, you have very, very hands-on experience working with women at the local level, a little bit like Denise, especially closer to women's group in a different reality in Tanzania. You have seen firsthand the importance of fostering local partnership, first and foremost to ensure, of course, national commitment, and most importantly, to see commitments translated into concrete and positive action for women on the ground. So Rachel, can you tell us a little bit more about ways in which we can increase national commitment and ensure that those commitments are actually turned into action for concrete improvement for women and girls at the local level? Thank you, Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Elania. Thank you very much also for this opportunity. I will start basically by providing maybe just a very, very brief policy and a legal context of Tanzania. Tanzania, like many other African countries, is a signatory of various international and regional human rights commitments and conventions, but also various development frameworks. And Tanzania has a Legal Aid Act, which formalizes legal aid service provision in the nation, but also we have a very strong strategic plan for the judiciary, which is jointly funded by the World Bank and also by the state. And this puts access to justice for women as a critical component for service delivery at the national level. And through part of the support that we have had through the strategic plan for the judiciary, we have also been able to see digitalized judicial services, which has been very, very concrete and especially critical at this time of COVID-19. But also the existence of a national plan of action to end violence against women and children. We are seeing this as also a critical policy document that has enabled us to create an enabling environment for justice for women and girls, and for this particular element to thrive, and of course ensure that the CEDAW principles and applications are applicable at the various levels. So if I could go straight into responding to the questions that you asked, I will mention 3 important points. The first is basically around using judicial precedents that are gender sensitive to ensure increased national commitments and actions on justice for women and children. And definitely through ensuring that we reform the judicial institutions and making them more effective, and ensuring accountability and gender responsive justice institutions. We see this as a quick means in terms of ensuring action for justice for women and girls. So in our experience in UN Women Tanzania office, we have been able to work with the Tanzania Women Judges Association and ensured strengthening capacities of both women and male judicial officers, and also the non-judicial officers, and ensured comprehensive trainings, but also we have worked with the Tanzania Women Judges Association in terms of developing a gender bench book for women's rights. That is a tool also to engage legal professionals in terms of dispensing their duties and to ensure gender justice, especially in the issues of violence against women and children. And also the element of institutionalizing women's rights, of course, within the National Judicial Training Institutions, which is also part of the work that we have done with the Women Judges Association, to ensure that we incorporate curriculums on women's rights within the judicial institutions. The other element that I would love to pose is investing in strategic litigation and also test case litigation, and especially when we are dealing with discriminatory legislations against women and girls, and having some of these discriminatory legislations that are rooted in traditions, in cultures, in norms, in religions, and ensuring then that you reform both the formal and also the informal legal norms is an area of emphasis for us. And for instance, with the work that we have done and through the efforts of women and girls' rights organizations towards ending child marriage in Tanzania, they were able to file a petition in the High Court, and the High Court declared the provisions on child marriage unconstitutional. And during a recent appeal decision, we have also seen the appeal court upholding these rulings and this decision, and declaring the age of marriage for both girls and boys as 18. So it's really critical when we are dealing with issues of repealing of discriminatory legislations, to ensure that we don't only look at strategic litigation, but ensure that we have targeted initiatives that build and keep momentum and ensure that the pressure groups also continue their interventions. And so as UN Women, we have also worked with the Parliamentary Women's Caucus, and also having targeted initiatives and advocacy with traditional leaders and different religious groups, but also working closely with the media and working with the ministries, especially the Ministry of Justice, and ensuring a multi-sectoral and complementary approach as we deal with the issues of review of discrimination. I wanted to end on a note and maybe providing this as a recommendation that to be able to have transformative impact, it's important that governments support coordinated legal aid service provision, especially in this context of COVID-19. And especially as we are looking at the African context where we have very high fees in engaging private legal representation, but also considering poverty levels, and of course, the economic barriers that many women have in terms of accessing private legal representation, that it is really critical that we invest in legal aid so that we are able to ensure justice for the vast majority of women and girls in our African context. So as UN Women, we have worked with our partners, Tanzania Network for Legal Aid Providers, in terms of providing digitalized legal aid services. And we have been able to do this to 100,000 women and girls receiving legal aid during this time of COVID. Let me end here and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for your contribution. And let me move immediately. We are actually running late. So if I could ask our panelists to a little bit keep to the time, otherwise we won't have time to get questions, to answer questions from our participants. Teresa, in our daily work at IDLO, and you are the country manager for our office in Kenya, you've been providing support to the State Department of Gender and the National Council on the Administration of Justice in developing sexual and gender-based violence related protocols within the context of the pandemic, of course. Can you tell us a bit more about this experience? What were the key challenges that you encountered? What does it mean working at the micro level, supporting these processes day by day, and supporting really in the details of the development of domestic laws and policy-making processes? Thank you, Teresa. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilaria, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. In the interest of being brief, I'll try and keep my remarks very focused to the question that Ilaria has posed. I think just to give a bit of context, as you correctly note, Ilaria, our work in Kenya has really been about supporting the reduction of the justice gap for women and girls. And our work, particularly with response to developing protocols to respond to issues related to SGBV in the pandemic, was premised on work that we'd already been doing with the State Department for Gender Affairs, as well as the NCAJ and other justice actors. And just to give a bit of background, which will speak, I think, to part of the second question that you asked in terms of what it actually means to work at the micro level. One of the things we had done is we have been working with the State Department of Gender Affairs to develop a prototype gender SGBV law, as well as policy at the county level, because you will notice that, you know, you develop laws at the national level, but also because government has devolved to the county level, it is also important at that level to facilitate, you know, a legal response to sexual and gender-based violence. And I think it's one of the lessons that we can learn, even in the context, I think, of a pandemic, because I think it was the, I don't know if it was Liv Torres who said at the beginning that it's very, very important to also begin to look at how we are dealing with, you know, SGBV at all the levels of response in the governance structures. So to come back, I think, to the specific point that you raised, one of the things we noted with the COVID pandemic was that, and I think everybody has said it, that there was a marked increase in cases of sexual and gender-based violence during the, you know, during the pandemic. Obviously, people were locked down. I think we also had, I think, a period in Kenya where we had a very strict lockdown for the first, I think, from March to about June, July. So courts were not operating, and there was basically a shutdown, which meant that for survivors and victims of sexual and gender-based violence, it was very difficult to access services. And we also noted that in as much as there is an understanding of the referral pathway of how people should be able to access services, that wasn't happening as well as it should. So it got us to come back to the drawing table and begin to look at how we can facilitate a case management process that enables survivors and victims of sexual and gender-based violence to be able to access services even during times of crisis. So that meant beginning to look at the whole justice chain. So for example, looking at what are the mechanisms in place for survivors and victims to be able to access, for example, police services? What are the mechanisms in place for the cases to be moved very quickly within the justice chain from the police to prosecution and ultimately to the courts? Because another thing that was also emerging was that with the shutdown of courts and very limited operations happening, sexual and gender-based violence cases were not being prioritized. So where you would ordinarily have fast tracking of cases, that wasn't happening because courts weren't operating optimally. So what we then did is, in partnership with the NCAJ, we began to look at the justice chain response and start working on how do we devise a case management system that facilitates expediting the cases of sexual and gender-based violence once they are reported in the system, or at whatever point of the justice chain the cases are. As I said, one of the things we noted was there was a spike. I think around about June, July, they had noted a 30% increase in cases of sexual and gender-based violence cases being reported in the system, despite a lot of the facilities and service providers not being available to address the issues that were being coming into the system. So one of the things I think that we noted that in terms of the experiences, one of the challenges was that, and I think this is something that is common the world over, is that for every one case that you find in the system, there are many others that have not been reported because people are at home, and the places that should be places of safety in many cases become the crime scenes. So one of the challenges we had was we never got a full understanding of the picture or the extent of the sexual and gender-based violence. So even the interventions that were being proposed, even the amendments or the proposal to case management are really premised on evidence that already exists in the public domain, but largely anecdotal because we don't have, concrete statistics. That was the first thing. The second thing was that generally, I think Dora spoke about this in the context of Latin America. Traditionally, sexual and gender-based violence cases tend to also find themselves being dealt with outside of the formal justice system. So again, there's also the challenge around, as you develop a case management system that speaks to justice actors and responses by justice actors, to what extent can you begin to incorporate aspects that also address the addressing of those cases in the not so formal, justice systems, so to speak. So I think that was another challenge. Another challenge was also, even as we work on the case management system, we cannot run out of the reality that we were looking at a more national response, a more national case management system, and yet you also need to think about, as I said earlier, the county level, where again, there are mechanisms and systems for dealing with cases of sexual and gender-based violence. So for us, I think that was a major challenge in terms of how to bridge that gap between the sort of national and local level governance systems to be able to create a case management system that actually responds appropriately. I think the second, sorry, Larry.
Thank you, Teresa. Teresa, in the interest of time, because we have only 5 minutes left and many questions, if you don't mind, I will stop you here to allow also Tatiana to have her presentation. But please, there are many questions, so please stay with us because this is all extremely interesting for us. And Tatiana, moving to you, you are leading the OECD's work on gender equality in public life and equal access to justice, which is in itself a very complex and yet essential portfolio to ensure justice for women and girls across the globe. From your perspective, what is the importance of increasing national commitment and action? And tell us also a little bit more about the international and legal and regional alliances to ensure legal empowerment and access to justice for women. What are the challenges that we are currently facing? Are there any innovative solutions on the horizon? Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Ilaria. And it's admittedly challenging to be the last speaker after such an excellent and expert string of interventions, and also running out of time. But I'm certainly being extremely delighted to have an opportunity to be here, yes, with such a distinguished group, but then also on a topic which is so essential to also be addressed during this Global Week of Justice, and which is also core to the OECD work on access to justice and addressing violence against women. As been already mentioned by many speakers before me, women still continue experiencing multiple and compounding barriers in accessing justice, especially during the current crisis. And we know that these barriers range from the lack of information to digital divides, to gaps in digital skills, to gender-biased judicial or police systems, limited financial means, so on and so forth. And then we also know that justice systems are also extremely complex and often fragmented and siloed, which can result in fragmented and sometimes different proceedings when there is a single case of, let's say, a woman facing the reality of violence. So we also know from both the work that we are doing with the countries and actually what we hear from the countries is that justice problems do not come on their own. They are often connected to problems related to custody of children, family relationships, finding employment, dealing with the health issues. So this really calls for an integrated approach, and so that we cannot be looking at justice pathways separate from the need to address all of those other issues. And what we see among some of the challenges and I would say bottlenecks is really what Ms. Jelani was talking about is the lack or limited structures to provide survivor or women and girls-centered responses to address those challenges, be that related uneven or even lack of coordination among different pieces of justice chain or across different government departments, across different levels of government, limited investments, or evidence on actually what actually is making a difference and for whom. So to go back to your question really briefly on how we can foster national action, and I think that there were already many really excellent elements of response that were provided, including the role of civil society and women's movement, women in leadership, because we do see that greater parity in leadership across all branches of power can actually lead to more inclusive policies, more inclusive and responsive services, and to help eliminate biases from the justice systems. There were also discussions on the role of legal frameworks and oversight. So all of it is really, really fundamental. But let me extremely briefly highlight a few additional points. First is the role of evidence and data. Here, we really need to invest in better understanding women's needs and their experiences with justice systems and their pathways. Also through the intersectional lens. So what works and for whom, for which groups of women and under what circumstances. And the OECD has been, of course, promoting legal use of legal needs surveys to understand the experiences of different groups of people. But then, of course, there is a greater scope to incorporate a gender lens into the overall system of national statistics, or mandating regular data collection and evaluation within legal frameworks, both nationally and cross-nationally. And this can actually help design targeted and tailored responses to respond to the specific needs of women, besides actually raising awareness, raising political will and understanding of actually what it takes to provide these responses. Secondly, and connected to the first point, is that we really do need to understand how much it costs for women not to access justice. So what is that societies and economies are losing from the inability to address these problems? In other words, we need to, and this is actually what we are saying everywhere, but this is particularly important when it comes to the needs of women and girls. So we need to show what is the cost of failure to act. And this is critical. And maybe the final point, and this brings me to the other part of your question, Ilaria, on the importance of leveraging international commitments and partnerships. We know that SDG agenda is a critical milestone in kind of getting the collective action underway for the states. But here, of course, goals 5 and 16 are particularly relevant for this agenda, and the recent adoption of the new indicator on access to justice, 16.3.3, with the UNDP, UNODC, and OECD being co-custodians, can serve as one of those leverage points to also continue engaging the states, both to monitor who is actually getting access to justice and who is left behind, but then also actually closing the gaps. And on partnerships, I'd like to echo what was said by Liv Taylor in terms of this week, this event being an excellent example of what international alliances and international partnerships can do to bring justice leaders from around the world together to close these crucial gaps, to advance the development of common frameworks, to exchange well, lessons learned and practices that work, but then also that don't work, and continue yes, fostering collective action to really address this fundamentally crucially important agenda. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. The points that you made are very important, and we are going to be following especially the development of the new indicator that you mentioned on access to justice. 16.3.3 is extremely valuable for us to start reporting against that indicator and see how progress is made. So thanks for all of your comments on that. Now, there are so many questions that as a moderator, I just cannot close without at least acknowledging some of the questions. We will not have time, because I know that many of you will have to go into other meetings. So we will not have time to respond necessarily, but let me say, just take 2 minutes. There are many questions about the involvement of men in the empowerment of women and girls. So we will all, I think, be on the same line in recognizing that the involvement of men is extremely important because obviously progress in women and girls' rights cannot be achieved without the full involvement, support, continued engagement of men in solutions. So Tyler, for example, asked about the involvement of men. We also have a number of questions on GBV training. So training GBV in GBV issues at communities. Marta from Uganda, for example, would like to know more about training for women on GBV issues. We also have questions about women representation and decision-making, the importance of decision-making in the justice sector, the presence of women as decision-makers. Nancy Simpson and Ukpeme Okon from International Federation of Women Lawyers USA branch would like to know more about it. There are also questions about improvement of laws in prevention of GBV from Rocio Figueroa from Venezuela, for example. Thank you also colleagues from the Philippines who would like to know more about solutions for fighting the pandemics. And I could go on and on and on. There are questions from Eirini about steps to be taken for women trapped in situation of violence in COVID-19. I think many of these questions have been very well answered and explored by the panel. So I'm confident that we will, our colleagues, our participants will have found already so many solutions, but it's also clear that as IDLO, and I'm sure I can speak on behalf of our partners as well, we will need to find time to organize a follow-up meeting because the issue is so important. So we are definitely committed to learn more about it, to discuss more about it, and to hear from you, the participants and panelists and our distinguished speakers, more about it. So for the moment, I will need to conclude by just thanking all of you for your commitment, for the action that you're taking at the global and at the local level, for your support throughout this project to make women and girls' justice at the core of sustainable development. So with that, thank you again from IDLO and all of our partners, and have an excellent rest of the day, and wishing you all the very best. Thank you so much, and see you next time, I promise. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Many thanks.
Bye.
Looking forward to the follow-up.
Many thanks. Thank you very much for such a fruitful discussion.
Thank you.